All right. Hangout is live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking About Survivor. I am Christiana Ellis.
I'm Mike Mateen.
And we're going to be talking about Survivor, David Vs Goliath, episodes 6 and 7. We're catching up due to some slight changes in scheduling due to the fact that I am in the Republic of Korea right now. And for me, it is 9:25 a.m. on Sunday morning.
And for me, it's Saturday early evening.
Yeah. So it's a little bit more difficult to schedule these broadcasts. And so, but we are making it happen. So we're going to be talking about episodes 6 and 7. And so as we've done before, when we do two episodes worth, it doesn't really make any sense to try to preserve spoilers or anything like that. So certainly when we're talking about things that happened in the first episode, we don't have to pretend we don't know what later happens in the second episode.
Right. And we'll probably spend less time than we would normally on the first episode because it is less fresh in our minds, even with notes.
Well, and also there's not suspense because in a lot of ways, the speculative sort of nature of what might the fallout of X be is cut short when we know the answer.
Yep.
So let's talk then. Let's jump back and talk about episode 6. And it began with the, coming back from having just voted out Natalie. And even though it's a little petty, Angelina talking about how it's bittersweet because it was bitter for Natalie and sweet for everybody else was kind of a good burn, even if it's a little mean, but still. But yeah, so it suggests, along with what happens in this later one, that like, for example, Mike was worried about being seen as a traitor to the Goliaths for, if he were to vote out another Goliath, but like nobody seems to be worried about having Natalie gotten voted out. It's like,
yeah,
it's like everyone's like, no, I get it.
No, it was more of a concern going into the vote in this episode, I think, because had he voted twice in a row to do it, or is it 3 times in a row?
Well, so Lyrsa was voted out in episode 6.
No, but I mean, what I'm saying, if he had done it.
Oh, yeah. Well, so I think
it would have been twice in a row, right? Like, because they voted for.
Well, so it was Natalie had been voted out, and then before her it was Natalie, and so sorry. Natalie voted out, and then Natalia before that. So, yeah.
Right, so it would have been the 3rd Goliath in a row to go, right. And he would have done it twice in a row. That's what I was thinking.
Critically, the one that instead of going from, even, like, it's one thing to deplete the surplus to the point where it's even. It's another to say, okay, if we now vote out another Goliath, we actually have fewer people than the Davids. So.
Yes, so that's why that's why no one really worried about it, because she was disliked by both. Every tribe she'd been on, she was disliked.
Yeah.
Unfortunately for her. So he had some cover here. Had he decided to blindside Angelina at the end of this, or not blindside her, had he decided to vote against her.
Vote against her, yeah.
Yeah, then that would have been a little bit more troublesome.
Well, it also seemed like, I mean, given that the vote seemed to be unanimous at the end, it also makes it seem more likely that there wasn't really any question of it actually being Angelina to get voted out, but rather just a matter of Elizabeth attempting to cause drama in order to save herself, which good for her, Right. I mean, we'll get more into that because you get this. It was a perfect illustration of the dynamic of ethics in a competition like this one, right? You know, behavior that would probably be thought of as not especially good or nice in real life, but this is specifically not real life.
Right.
Yeah. So in any case,
well, what I think is funny about these episodes is that we were actually talking about two different episodes. I was talking about Lyrsa's pitch to get rid of Angelina.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And you were talking about Elizabeth's pitch to get rid of Angelina. But I think all of that actually is relevant to back chronologically to where we are, because this is sort of where Angelina has kind of put herself as a person that people are looking at.
Yeah.
You know, when she says, "Oh, well, you know, I only voted against you, Lyrsa, because I wanted to pretend that I was with Natalie so that she would still like me and give me her jacket." And it was just like, what? Like,
well, also, I think, you know, we may get more into this later, but Angelina was kind of, I think, unknowingly falling into a trap of, you know, I don't think this is like a thing, like as a common phrase, but she was kind of displaying selfish empathy, in the sense that it was more about her wanting to see herself as a good, compassionate person than it was about actually feeling those things for the other person.
Right.
Yeah. And so I think that to my mind, diminishes somewhat any question of whether Elizabeth did anything wrong in her sequence. But let's not jump too far ahead there. But it's all relevant because, of course, one of the things that happens in this early sequence is that Nick and Mike are commiserating with each other that Angelina's kind of a phony. She seems like she wants to have everybody like her, even when she's doing some things that would realistically and reasonably make people not like her. You know, I'm going to do things that hurt your game, but I don't want you to think I'm a bad person.
Right. And, you know, to speak of the selfish thing of, you know, for her to just think that, oh, well, I can just explain this away to Lyrsa that I just wanted her jacket.
Mm-hmm.
Like, but you still wrote Lyrsa's name down, who you now have to continue to play the game with.
Yeah.
And that is why Lyrsa targeted you of all the people, because, you know, when it was her that was going to be, you know, the choice, because it was really easy to point to you because of doing that. Whereas if you just hadn't done that,
mm-hmm.
not to say you still wouldn't have been the person that Lyrsa would have tried to convince people to go for, but it wouldn't have made it so easy.
Yeah. Well, you know, in this early bit where we had Lyrsa really wanting to hold this against Angelina, my feeling at that time was that I didn't think she was wrong for feeling the way she did, but I worried that she was going to hurt her own game by being too stubborn about that.
Right.
And that, you know, so I think that, you know, it was reasonable to be angry, but maybe not helpful.
Right. And she, to her credit, like, she came out of it and she used it the right way. Instead of like, I want to get rid of Angelina because I'm angry with her, she made a compelling case as to why it would make sense, you know, for her to stay around and Angelina to go.
Yeah. And honestly, even though Angelina has now survived 2 attempts to characterize her in this way, nonetheless, I think her game might be sort of irrevocably damaged at this point. I'm not sure how she could turn it around and win at this point.
Right. Especially now that we're into the jury. Like, there's, you know, at this point, like, there's enough credible distrust of her that it's going to be very difficult, even if she made it to the end, for her to then, you know, actually win it. So, I think that she's in trouble.
Yeah, especially given that the exact complaint about her is that she is just being nice to people to butter up potential jury members. So like, how do you recover from that, regardless of whether it's a true accusation? Like, what can you do from there? It inherently puts this layer of suspicion on any nice thing she does for anybody.
Yep.
So that's a tough spot, and to some extent, it's sort of like the Greek tragedy, in the sense that she definitely brought it on herself, but I think it ended up being sort of portrayed as more extreme than it actually was.
Right. I think both those things are accurate.
Yeah. So Christian continues to be adorable in this show. He is just fun to watch. I really hope that there's no, I feel like the editors know that the audiences like him, because every single preview gives us the tiniest little hint that it might be him that's in trouble.
Yeah.
But in episode 6, he talks about his attempt to go survivor spearfishing and putting on the flippers when he's still like 15 feet out from the water, and
trying to walk.
And it's hard to walk. And he's like, well, yeah, because yes.
Yeah, exactly. That's why you're not supposed to put them on back there, and then yeah.
Well, or you just acknowledge that that's how it works. It's like, it's only awkward if you're making it awkward.
It's true. Yeah.
Everybody, like, nobody looks graceful trying to walk in flippers on land. It's not a graceful motion. But in any event, we get him making an attempt to go spearfishing, but ultimately unsuccessful. We had the reward challenge for cooking utensils, spices, and kebabs. Let's see. This was the one with the obstacles, and they're all on the rope that they could get like tangled up in. Yeah. And then the ring toss for the end. Dan leads the way for Tiva in the green buffs to win by being great at the ring toss. So Tivo got first place, and then Jabini got second. So even in episode 6, I have a note right here where Mike is talking about starting to be distrustful of Angelina, but recognizing, especially with Natalie having gotten out, he might have to keep Angelina around so that it's not seen as him turning against the Goliaths.
Right.
Yeah. So that thread is begun, even in this episode. My note here is Dan misses Kara, eats peppers. But he talks about being really happy with his game right now, especially with 2 idols in his pocket, which, as a strong performer in challenges and having 2 idols, that is absolutely a strong place in the game. And he seems to have several sincere allies.
Right.
I think that I'm not sure how strong his social game is, or his strategic game maybe, because he seems to have formed real relationship and friendships with people that can be good as allies, but he also doesn't seem to have a very sophisticated assessment of the games that everyone else are playing.
Right.
It's that classic game theory mistake of not realizing that other people are making plans too.
Right, and that's what concerns me about him. Like, the 2 idols for him, in my mind, could potentially be, a negative outcome for him, because of how he sort of has gone into, oh, well, I'm super okay because I have these great alliances. I have this awesome duo with Kara, and I have 2 idols, so I can just kind of not worry about anything. And he will make, like, I'm worried that it'll make him not aware if someone tries to blindside him to get rid of his idols.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, especially since I think, given that he has two, he's probably not as careful about keeping it secret that he has any. So people are going to try to blindside him whether he has one or two.
Right.
Yeah. And especially when we see the merge and he reunites with Kara, and even despite his original intention to keep the second idol secret just for him, he tells her anyway.
Right.
And so that's just he's playing a solid game in 2 out of the 3 respects. But I so like he seems like he's forming real relationships with people, which is good, or can be good at least.
Yep.
He's obviously strong in challenges. He's proactive in going out and searching for idols. Like, all of these are good things, but it does feel like there's still kind of a very surface level strategic analysis going on.
Yes.
That said, the whole brochacho thing with John and Christian continues to be delightful.
Yes. Interesting.
Aren't brochachos just adorable? Brochachos feed each other. It's great. It's TV gold.
Yes.
And then, of course, here's where we have the only sort of dash of sadness about the brochacho thing is that Gabby feels like she's left out of it, that her strongest ally is now part of some other group that doesn't include her, which is 100% reasonable, both from a strategic and just a personal standpoint. Just the feeling left out in general in an emotional sense, but also, yeah, that's actually bad for her game. Because now it seems like in episode 7 that there is actually some acknowledgement of, I don't know if it was maybe a combination of her own actions and Christian vouching for her, that it seems like both of them are included in this possible cross-tribe alliance.
Yes. And it gave her a little bit more confidence, which is good, because while her feelings were accurate, her reaction, I don't want to call it overreaction. I mean, but it felt like, to me, like an overreaction,
Well, getting emotional about it isn't the solution that she needs.
Right. That's not going to do you any good to just, every time you feel left out, to just break down into tears to the camera or to Christian or to whatever. Like, you jeopardize him continuing to vouch for you if he is nervous that this is going to keep happening, even if he likes you. Christian, at some point, like, it's going to come down to that. And if he's seeing you as, yes, she's my friend, but yes, there is also this other emotional piece that I have to deal with. And if I decide to make whatever this decision is that's going to have her go out, whenever that comes, like, then he's going to do it. And then she's going to be even more upset. And we're going to, it's like, just get a handle on that a little, even though you're what's prompting it is real and accurate. Like, you got to reel it in a little.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's absolutely, there are so many illustrations in these couple of episodes about how emotional reactions to things that are 100% understandable are nonetheless not helpful within the context of the game. Right. And even if Christian does not mind her breakdowns like that, breakdowns maybe overstating, but her emotional reactions to that, like, even if he doesn't mind, even if that doesn't push him away, it could just contribute to a broader feeling of other people seeing her as weak, which could complicate. Even if he's trying to vouch for her, it might make it harder sell. In any event, though, there's discussion. She reaches out to Allison, and she makes herself vulnerable to Allison, which actually, we were just talking about the downside of being emotional, but her making herself vulnerable in that way did actually seem to get through Allison's defenses in a way that was actually helpful.
Yep.
So, and then they discuss blindsiding Dan. You know, it's funny. I'm reading through because I have all my notes for both episodes in the same one, but it's surprising how many of my notes for episode 6 have payoffs or continuing threads into episode 7.
Yep.
That's some good season-long editing, narrative building from the editors.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we're about to start to get into another one.
Which one are you thinking? I was just talking about they discussed blindsiding Dan. But what one are you?
I'm saying, like, yeah, I know, but after that, like, whatever the thing that comes next is also has a payoff and a continuing thread in this episode 7, and that's when we go back over and Elizabeth has her sore back.
Yes, yeah.
Because of the, you know, and so it starts to put her at odds with her own tribe mate. You know.
Yeah.
And it's also another thing similar to Gabby in that her desire to have the shelter and the bed be comfortable for her and, you know, and not, you know, hurt her back anymore is understandable. And her frustration with the fact that they don't want to do it and it's causing her this, you know, this discomfort, which makes her even a little bit more irate about it.
Yeah.
Does not necessarily justify the reaction and the way in which she went forward with it, which was to, I mean, it's not even really passive aggressive. It was sort of subtly aggressive.
Well, it was. So we don't know how much she actually pushed for it before the inciting incident of this argument, right? Like, for all we know, this is something she's been complaining about every single day, and she's just had it because nobody's listening to her, and she's suffering and nobody cares, and so she's angry about that, which is still maybe not a helpful reaction, but we could say she's mentioned it. But if what's happened is that she's been suffering in silence up till now, and now she just can't hold it in anymore, and it's exploding out of nowhere for everyone else, that's a harder, you know what I mean? It's like, we could understand, like, if she had been mad about this, but not saying anything about it for days, and then it blows up, everyone else is kind of in more of a position of feeling like, okay, you need to talk to us first and we can figure out a time to do this, rather than you just spontaneously deciding close to the evening that it has to happen now and there's no negotiation about it. We could have done it earlier in the day if you had said something, right? Or is it a matter of she has been complaining about it and her concerns have just been dismissed? We don't really know.
Yeah, and the feeling that I get, and you know, there's obviously we don't see all of it, is that she has talked about wanting to do this and been pushing for it, and no one has really taken her up on it.
Right.
But that she wasn't direct with why. That's what I got from it. Like, I feel like if this had been like something that she, for a couple of reasons, if this had been something that she had been doing for a while that they had been dismissing, I feel like there would have been some threads of that in the editing so that we see that this is the payoff to her continuing to ask and then being dismissive. There's also, you know, she does almost talk about that there was almost this pride of suffering in silence because she didn't want people to see her as weak. So again, she was probably talking about it and hoping someone would take the bait of we should do this, because they all seemed to understand that this was something that she wanted also. You know, so it wasn't like it caught them by surprise that this was a thing she wanted. It caught them by surprise this was a thing that she wanted this badly enough to make this big of a deal. Right. So yeah. Like
maybe she had suggested it a number of times, but had not put it in the context of, I have not been able to sleep and I've been in pain every day because of this. And that's why I want to do it.
Right.
If she had just been kind of saying a couple of times, hey, you know, what we should really do at some point is fix the floor. And everyone's like, oh yeah, at some point.
Right. Yeah, because all of them understood like what was happening when she started to cut the logs. They're like, oh, well, you know, she's been saying this for a while and now she's just I guess, going to do it when we don't have time to do it, as opposed to, they didn't feel like this was a thing that, like I said, that she needed. They felt like it was clear that she had said something about it.
Mm-hmm.
It did not seem like they understood that this was so important to her, and she had never made that clear.
Yeah.
So it's sort of, I think it kind of fell somewhere in between. And that's why I said it was like, it almost felt passive aggressive, but it's almost like it was not passive aggressive in the normal way that you use it. It was passive until the breaking point when it became aggressive.
Yeah. Well, exactly. And the thing is too, that like, I wasn't sure, it was hard to know, like in terms of taking sides, because on the one hand, we can talk about her passive aggressive becoming aggressive behavior, but also I felt like, it felt to me like a lot of Carl's complaint about it wasn't really about anything other than the fact that he was trying to sleep and she disturbed him in the middle of the afternoon by doing this project.
Right.
Because that's kind of like, I don't know if that was all it was, but he mentioned it. We saw that happen, and he mentioned it twice, that he was trying to sleep and it was bothering him. And it's like, okay, if everyone's having a hard time sleeping at night and you want to sleep during the day, like, I mean, I get it, but also like, people have to do stuff during the day, it's like, so I don't know. I felt like he was.
That's a bizarre thing. It's like when, your significant other has to go to the airport at 5 a.m, which, just recently happened to me. It's not like I can be mad that they're up getting ready for the airport. Like, that's just something that sometimes people have things to do. Like, it's the same thing. Like, you're in a group of people, you're in a social relationship. Like, people are not going to just cater to your schedule and whatever you feel like. Yeah.
So, like, at some point, there's not going to ever be a good time to do it where nobody is inconvenienced, but it's also a project that's intended to benefit everybody.
Right.
It's like, so I felt like, without the context, it was hard to know, but I felt like even at the same time that there might be some complaints about the way she handled it, I felt like he was making a bigger deal about it. And that's what inspired the argument. Because it also, I mean, again, we don't know all the details, but I was not clear on why it was not a project that you could do part of at one time and then part of at another time, and why that means that it's impossible to get started on it when you don't have all day.
Well, the way that I understood the original plan, which sort of seemed to change, and so I think there were some pieces missing to it, is it looked like what they originally wanted to do was take the current logs that were in the shelter and cut them in half. And that's what made it tough, is it meant that everyone had to agree to not be in the shelter while they started taking these logs out, or they had to agree that like half of it was going to happen. And, and then we saw them dragging logs out of the forest later, which means there's probably another confrontation that we didn't see where they stopped her from taking the logs in there. So she was like, well, then I'm just going to go get new logs. I feel like that happened too.
Yeah.
Like an escalation to this where it didn't just go from I'm cutting logs to we're in this massive like verbal argument. I think there was a number of things that happened, and that Carl got frustrated, told them to stop doing it, to stop taking the logs. I'm not getting up. And they said, well, we need the logs because this and that. And then they went and started dragging giant palm trees through and like knocking into everybody, and just being
it was clear by that time that she was already mad. And like, it wasn't just she was deciding to do this. It was like they had already tried to interfere with something she was actively working on.
Right. So it ratcheted up quickly,
Right. Yeah. And so it's all like, I think we can probably attribute the whole thing to something that didn't need to be a big deal in any respect, but it was communications breakdown on a few levels, probably.
Yes.
Because it was perhaps her suffering in silence up to the point where she's in pain and she's mad and she's feeling disrespected and not listened to, even though she hadn't really done an adequate job of communicating her situation before then. But also, instead of everyone else trying to understand more why she felt like it had to be done right then and getting, and coming to more of a consensus, they were just trying to shut her down and not listen to what she had to say.
Right.
So in any event, I still kind of liked Elizabeth, so I was feeling inclined to want to be on her side, even though I suspect that, she contributed her fair share to that argument.
Yeah, and I think I wanted to like her too, and I fell sort of on the, this is how social interactions work. Like,
yeah,
sometimes you kind of, see both sides of it, and I wanted her to get it done so she didn't have a sore back, but I did not think that she handled it in the most correct way in order to accomplish what she was trying to do.
Yeah. So that brings us pretty much up to the immunity challenge. I think we had a brief note with Kara just observing that there's a rift even amongst the Davids and being happy about that. But so in the this was the immunity challenge with carrying the water saucer, which I thought was a fun challenge. And this was an example where Jabini really had a hard time with this one. And,
yeah.
It seemed like at least part of it had to do with this thing was clearly heavy, but also Mike seemed to be like his arm was hurting or something.
I think his arm was hurting because of how heavy it was. It was like cutting into his forearms.
Yeah. But I guess I just wasn't clear on why that was bothering him more than everyone else.
I think because he's not as strong and his team wasn't as strong.
Well, yeah, I guess that's true. Is that if you have 5 strong people trying to lift a thing, each individual person is having an easier time as opposed to 5 weaker people. Yeah. In any event, it's Tiva got first place again. That was a pretty dominant sub-tribe. It's all moot again now, though, now that there's been a merge. But Buku got second place, and so Jabini was going to tribal council. We get a little bit of emotion from Mike explaining why, it was interesting because they sort of framed it as, you kept trying even though it was hopeless, but it kind of felt like that was a slow motion quitting anyway. You know what I mean? It's kind of like nobody kind of wanted to just give up, but kind of by the end, they really actually kind of did.
Yeah.
When it was really imminent. So I think that was the emotion was from a process of several minutes. Here's a doggy.
Listen to the podcast, bud. I
know. So in the a several minute process of feeling like this is hopeless. Should we keep trying? We feel like we should, but it's hopeless and this is really hard and this sucks and we're unhappy. Yeah, that's an emotional sort of experience.
Right, because nobody wants to be the one who says we should stop. We're never going to catch up and this is hurting us, because that you're going to lose. Everybody knew you're going to lose, so you don't want to be the one who admits defeat because you're going to tribal council. So yeah, they're in this just awkward position of trying, no one wanting to admit they need to stop.
Yeah.
So.
Also, he talks a little bit about it not being as fun to vote people out as he thought it would be.
Correct. Yeah.
Which, on the one hand, I think it's you know, I mean, I guess it's sort of an understandable reaction. You know, part of the fun of the game from a spectator point of view is people being eliminated, but at the same time, I guess my reaction there a little bit was, I kind of feel like I would expect that it's hard when you've actually bonded with people. Like, that's part of what's interesting about the game.
Right.
But yeah. So as we go into the tribal council for this one, we have Lyrsa still pretty much holding the vote against Angelina, but it's also partly, as you said, defensive, because she recognizes that she is a likely target otherwise, and so she needs something to try to pin, you know, a vote on someone else.
Right.
And then Mike at this point is pretty much telling her, look, I don't actually even disagree with anything you're saying, but there's this larger piece of, you know, if we vote out another Goliath, then the other Goliaths in the merge are going to look at me and say, how did you let this happen?
Yep.
And he's probably not wrong. I mean, you know, we talked last time, I think, a little bit about how much the numbers really matter. And you don't ever know for sure, but at least going into episode 7, it seems like, you know, it did matter a fair amount, in the sense that this recognition that you could only have one person flip, and that would change the outcome.
Right. And even larger, though, than the numbers mattering is, I think, the perception.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because there's this pretense that you want to go in, if you're the stronger tribe with the larger numbers, you want to go into the merge with the larger numbers.
Mm-hmm.
You are the person who made that not happen, even if everybody else intended to not use it. Right. You've
taken a tool out of the toolbox.
Right. It's an easy shift also of if everybody also was intending to not use it. So then they need someone to focus their target on. They can all easily say, well, there's the guy who, you know, he's not trustworthy. We had the numbers. They can go to the other tribe and say, I know he voted with you, but we had the numbers and he went against that. He doesn't think rationally. We should get rid of him. You know, like there's that perception you want to get out of there. And,
mm-hmm.
you know, and he rightfully, I think, in this one made the right decision. I mean,
yeah. Well, and also I think there's, you know, if you're thinking a few layers deep, there's also the element for Mike of, if there were to be someone on the Goliath tribe who is a target, either now or later, he would like there to be someone who's the obvious name before him.
Right.
Namely Angelina.
Which, you know, paid off again in the next episode, in that she became the inevitable, you know, discussion of, well, if we don't do the easy vote with Elizabeth, because obviously, again, game theory, they're all going to be playing too. What are they going to be? Who are they going to be targeting? Because I don't want to be it, and I don't want somebody to make the decision that, actually, you know what, that makes sense. You know, and so he's thinking through that, whereas Angelina wasn't.
Yeah. So in any event, although Lyrsa made an effort, it looked like it was really just not finding any traction. So I think even Nick voted against her, because he recognized that, you know, the writing was on the wall. It wasn't going to happen. So he might as well not make an enemy of his, you know, the others he's going to still be there with.
Right.
So Lyrsa was voted out, which is a little bit sad, just because I kind of liked her, and it was she was unfortunately kind of just a casualty of the way the numbers ended up working out, right? Like, it was I don't think anyone would have been targeting her specifically otherwise.
Well, and this tribe in particular, I mean, this tribe was just not built to compete.
Yeah.
No, it wasn't. And, you know, it honestly made me, like, excited that they were going to merge, because, even getting rid of Lyrsa, who was probably their weakest link from a challenge perspective.
Physically, yeah.
Yeah, they still weren't strong.
Mm.
It was nice to have it kind of go and just shift out of that and not just watch them get obliterated, because
Right.
you know, I like everybody who's on that tribe, and you know, just to watch them struggle, like especially after that challenge that we just discussed, like
Mm-hmm.
to see them like try so hard, be so like, it wasn't a mental thing. It's not like they weren't mentally prepared to like compete. They literally physically could not do it.
Yeah, it was
And that
well,
was
just compared to the strong people who are on the other two tribes. Just they really didn't have anyone on that level.
No, and it wasn't with the spirit of the David versus Goliath, where it's like, you know, with where David is skilled in one area and happens to use his skill to exploit Goliath's weakness. Like, that's sort of the idea. But when there's no skill behind that. Like, that is literally just a physical task. And if you have those, you're just there's no way to overcome it.
Right. It's like it's a teamwork challenge, but you have to have the strength there, or else it falls apart, regardless of how well you work
as a team. If you physically cannot pick the thing up and carry it without sloshing water, yeah.
Right. So Lyrsa was voted out. The preview made us think Christian would be a target. David versus Goliath over, and those those preview beats are like, except for the fact that the merge happened, it's like neither of those were really much of a thing. But so we started right off the episode 7 with the merge. Carl talks about being excited to start playing for himself. I'm having a hard time warming to Carl, and I don't know if maybe some of it was lingering resentment about the argument with Elizabeth, but I don't know. I'm just like, he's something about him kind of just leaves me cold.
Yeah, his personality doesn't come across like good in this situation or TV or something. Like, I mean, not that he's not entertaining, but it's just he doesn't, like you said, he just makes you feel kind of cold. I agree with that, and I don't have the same bias towards Elizabeth, you know, in that argument that you do. I felt like that from the beginning, even before that happened.
Yeah, I mean, he does seem smart.
Yeah, I don't dislike him.
He's plugging along. Like, he hasn't done anything to hurt his game necessarily, but also, I don't know. But in any event, we get the merge feast. Everyone's very happy. John talks about being very pleased to have the calorie intake. We
fit his macros out on the island.
Yeah. We also do have him say, though, that although he does like Christian, his plan is to stay Goliath strong.
What are you doing? I'm on a podcast. You need to get down. Off. Go watch the game.
You're on the podcast too.
You gotta go watch the game. You got your Georgia jersey on.
So it's interesting that John seems to have a very sort of game mindset on, and I wonder if some of that has to do with just the idea of pro wrestling and the face and the heel, and just like it's all part of the thing, And so the idea of like, I'm definitely friends with Christian. That doesn't mean that I'm going to try to keep him around if it doesn't make sense for me strategically, and he's just very matter of fact about it.
Yeah. I continue to like him, continue to like Christian. Yeah.
It's interesting that we have a beat where Gabby specifically talks about suspecting that there might be an advantage of some kind at the merge feast, but then doesn't find one.
Right.
And so that makes me wonder if there really was nothing, or did nobody find one?
This is not yours.
It's weird that they spent time on the idea when nothing came of it.
Yeah, I wasn't sure what was going on with all that.
Yeah. let's see. Carl pretty much is very open about the idea of Alec having turned on Natalia, which, from his perspective, from a strategic perspective, is actually a very smart thing to do because they're aware that the Davids versus Goliaths is potentially a thing. He needs to help the Davids to exploit any potential breach in the Goliaths. So, that was absolutely the right call to bring that up, I think. Let's see. Angelina is very concerned about Alec, and she's worried. She's worried that it takes only one to flip, and then it's a little bit ironic that it ends up being her that's sort of the presented as the branch point. Maybe just because she's kind of being seen, like the phony label has sort of been placed on her, whereas Alec, even though he actually turned on, is possibly more able to just say, well, look, I made a move in the game when it made sense to do so, but now I'm really with you guys. Right. And so I don't know. It's interesting that she is being portrayed as potentially phony, almost purely on emotional grounds, as opposed to actually changing any outcomes.
The other thing that I think Alec did well was kind of, circle that, take the other Goliaths who knew, he basically, without directly doing it, what are you doing? Stop. Directly saying, here's the pecking order of the Goliaths. Mm-hmm. He kind of identified who was going to be, if they stuck with the numbers, who was going to be on the bottom. So people like Mike, mm-hmm. and got them, circled a alliance with Davids and some of those Goliaths. So now he's got, when people are talking, now he's not one of the names anymore, because they're like, okay, this is sort of our secondary alliance. We're not really this isn't our thing, but we'd like to preserve it just in case. So yeah, if there's an alternative, if Angelina is an alternative, yeah, let's talk about her, and so he kind of intuitively did this, without, I don't think he strategically said, I'm going to take the lower down Goliaths and I'm going to grab some of the Davids and we're going to make this alliance so that I don't get talked about. But that is what ended up happening, Yeah.
So in any event, I think it's just interesting that that's kind of how it's shaken out. And it seems like it really does just come down to how they are each coming across to the people they talk to.
Right.
Because, Angelina did do some stuff, but it was none of it changed the outcome of who was going home.
Right. Well, and again, I think it comes back to what you were saying about, she's perceived as a phony because of the way that she talks to people. Whereas mm-hmm. Alec, even if he is shifting in the moment, he is genuine. When he's sitting with Christian, Gabby, Allison, Nick, and Mike, he mm-hmm. genuinely wants to work with them. Now, that doesn't, not going to change his mind when he goes and talks to somebody else, but he's communicating genuinely, whereas Allison or Angelina always feels like there's this facade of, I'm going to communicate with you as a potential alliance partner because that, would be good for us. It just doesn't ever click. Yeah.
I think that there is a little bit of an air with Angelina of it being very important to her that you think of her in a certain way.
Right.
And that can come across as condescending. Even sometimes if it's not, it can feel that way. And we'll come back more to that. So the new merge tribe is named Kalo Kalo after the name of the stars, I guess. And here's where, we just talked about Carl doing the smart thing of trying to, apply pressure to any splintering there might be in the Goliaths, but he is also trying to undermine Elizabeth, who he wants to get out because he thinks she's a know-it-all, which On the one hand, like, I'm torn because I think I might be biased on the basis of liking Elizabeth and not liking people to plot against her. But at the same time, um, it does perhaps make sense from a strategic point to say, well, we want to exploit any weaknesses in the Goliath tribe, but also if we fail to splinter them, I want the target of the, the elimination to not be me. And so I want there to be someone else.
Yep.
Who would be the name otherwise. And so telling Dan that Elizabeth was trying to, question the Dan and Kara thing.
Right.
Mason is glad to be back with Dixon. So that's fun. That just, Nick is fun too. It's like, I feel like I keep sort of forgetting about him, but then every so often he shows up and I'm like, oh yeah, Nick.
Well, yeah, because early on, like whatever the first episode or second or whatever, one of the early ones where he was kind of considered, he wasn't really firing on all cylinders. Looking back on it, and he wasn't really appealing. He just seemed kind of odd. He almost had like that Angelina feel of like a little bit know-it-all, a little bit condescending, a little bit like false. And as he sort of relaxed and been himself, he's actually kind of fun.
Yeah.
And really smart. Yeah.
It's funny because I think I rolled my eyes at this idea initially when he introduced the idea of wanting to have a name for every alliance he makes. I think I thought that was kind of silly, but rolled my eyes a little bit. But now I feel like I kind of really dig it.
Yeah. I mean, it's like branding.
Mason Dixon. It's good.
Because it's so easy for him to go to those people when he needs them. Mm-hmm. Like how much more, impactful is that to, come back get to this merge and say, Mason is back with Dixon. We're Mason Dixon. As opposed to like, hey man, I'm like so glad you're back because like we were pretty tight and we want to do this thing. Mm-hmm. Like it's just so much more. And and Mike, who may have forgotten about him and just be like, hey, rock stars are back, and you're like, yeah, they are. Like, yeah, I'm with you. As opposed to like, hey man. It's working.
He's definitely grown on me, for sure.
Yeah.
And so, and he demonstrates his sincerity, like both to Christian and to us, by sharing some very useful intel, which is that he thinks Dan has an idol. And we know, of course, that he's correct. He has two. But even knowing that there's one in play is very valuable information.
Yeah.
Dan and Kara are reunited. We talked about that a little bit already, that he just couldn't help himself. And he told her about the second idol too, even though he had explicitly planned to not do that when he found it.
Yep.
He's, so, I mean, good for Kara, I guess. Although, it's like, it's hard to know how, it's like, it doesn't seem like that relationship is actually strategic for either of them. Because if anything, it's been a hindrance so far on that level. It's been a reason to talk about both of their names.
Yeah, and I feel like it's, from a viewer perspective, it's probably been more of a hindrance on Kara, because we don't know much about her other than she's the person that Dan likes. Like she's done a couple of things. Like she's done nothing, but that's not. There's no lasting, thread with her other than Dan really likes her and likes Dan back, but maybe not as much. Like it's like you get this feeling like it's just kind of puts her in this odd spot as a viewer. And then some of that's the editing. Like it's not her fault,
Well, right. Like there's so many people still that it's hard to give a lot of screen time to everybody. And so really most of the screen time we've had with her is in context with the relationship with Dan. Right.
Whereas Dan gets more screen time because of his idols and things like that that have just led him to have more.
Yeah. So there's a few people that we haven't heard much from recently, like Allison and Davey, for example. We got a little bit more with Allison in this one, but like in the last episode, the only thing we saw from Allison really was the bit where Gabby confides in her. which pays off as things develop in this one with that alliance, but still.
Right, and Davey, same thing. We didn't see him in this one, and all we really saw of him in the last one was him siding with Carl against Elizabeth, which again had some payoff here, but you know, that you're right. Other than him, you know, not being Carl, like, because that's the thing is, like, had it just been Carl that was frustrated, it would have been easy to kind of paint that into a different light. But when Davey's also sitting there and being like, I don't get like why this has to happen right now. Like, I didn't know this was such a big deal. Like, that he kind of lends some credibility to the argument against what Elizabeth was doing. But anyway, but you're right. This episode, we didn't see much from them.
Yeah. So let's see. We have. Let's see. Yeah. So the Goliaths all get together and decide to have their sort of little consensus discussion. The initial target seems to be Elizabeth, but then there's a few people who want to blindside Christian, which of course makes me terrified. And but then we also have Alec telling the camera that the relationships he's formed with the Davids are real as far as he's concerned, and he wants to protect those. And so even if he is going to stay Goliath strong for now, he wants to try to make sure that the Davids that get taken out are not the ones that he has formed a tie with.
Right.
Which is good strategy on his part. He's playing pretty well, I think.
Well, yeah, and that's basically like what I was saying. Like that's the flip side. He also is benefiting from the flip side of that.
Yeah.
Is that when blindsides of or defections are being talked about of Goliaths, he's not being targeted because the Davids and some of the Goliaths don't want him to be that target. So he's done a really good job with that, you know.
Mm-hmm. So we got a little bit of stuff here with Elizabeth, you know, suspicious of Dan and Kara and thinking that they need to be targeted, it was kind of weird for that to actually happen after Carl had already been kind of telling them about that. It was just, but like he was right that that's where she was going to try to go, at least this early bit. And it's interesting when we have here Mike and Alec and Allison discussing amongst themselves that, yeah, we still want to try to take out, you know, stay Goliath strong for one, maybe two, but we understand it's going to break eventually. And so when it does, we want to be the ones that do it so that it doesn't get done against us. And so this is where we create this little alliance of this secret alliance of six with Christian, Gabby, Nick, Allison, Mike, and Alec. Strike force of six. I like all of that. And the only thing that I was a little bit bummed about is just kind of liking Elizabeth, but her not being a part of that, and them specifically talking about how they might have to kind of just sacrifice her. She's not part of their little strike force. And so in order for their plan to work, they kind of have to let a couple of Davids get voted out. And Elizabeth seems like the one to start with. So, you know, even though Gabby kind of tries to push back on that a little bit later, it seems like it was just meant to be. It just didn't break down in Elizabeth's favor.
Yeah.
I think, you know, as much as I kind of enjoyed her, I think she was lacking in some of the communication skills that would have helped her do better.
Yeah, I mean, it basically came down to it was inevitable. Like, she was just not going to win this game. And, you know, better just get her out now while she can still be on the jury and enjoy all that part of it. And, you know, let's carry on with some stronger players, you know.
There was an interesting turn in the whole Dan and Kara thing when, you know, Elizabeth rightly assumes that if any of the Goliaths were to flip, it might be Alex. So she's pretty shrewd in terms of making that assessment. But unbeknownst to her, she was right, but he had already made another plan that didn't include her. So that's why he basically shuts that down. And in fact, siding with her is counterproductive to his other plan, and so therefore he has to undermine it. So he goes and tells Dan and Kara what Elizabeth's saying, and Dan just has no idea why he would be targeted. And I was feeling like a little bit like, really? No idea? And even Kara seemed to be like, dude, you're like, what are you worried about right now? Like, this is like, you're blowing this out of proportion. And he seemed pretty mad about it. Yeah. I think ultimately nothing came of it because Elizabeth was the target anyway.
Right.
I think that it may have contributed, though, to the argument about whether or not they wanted to stick with voting out Elizabeth or change the blind side to Christian. Like, so he was definitely more on the side of wanting to get rid of Elizabeth for that reason. And so that whole dynamic was possibly shifted by it. Lots of moving pieces.
Yes.
So this got us to the immunity challenge, first individual immunity challenge of the series, this season, rather. And it was an interesting little dynamic, although it seemed like, as far as going out, I think only one person went out because they actually knocked the statue down. Every single other person did it just by failing to, like they bonked it into something, and so it stopped the momentum.
Yeah.
And so I think it was an interesting challenge, but overall, I maybe needs some tweaking.
Yeah, I just like that they went with something, new. I know we've talked a number of times on this podcast about how we've really liked the way they've taken successful challenges from the past and merged elements from different challenges to like make it kind of new.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, like they were starting to run out of those, and I like that they're trying new ones. I thought this one was interesting.
Yeah.
In concept, it didn't, like you said, didn't 100% play out the best way it could have, but I liked it,
Mm-hmm.
and so I ultimately left like satisfied that it existed, even if it wasn't as exciting or
yeah.
Yeah.
I did too. Like I thought it was a neat attempt, and it just, like I said, the more visually interesting way to fail of having the statue fall over ended up like that being less likely because it's so much easier to go out for some other reason.
Right.
Yeah. And so I thought it was, yeah. So I think we're on the same page there.
Yep.
So I will say that I really liked the audio component of it, though, with just the banging, the clanging sounds that it made, the resonating sound of when they would bonk it just a little bit.
Yeah, kind of like the like balls that you like.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was about to say roll in your hand, but that sounds awful.
Well, I think where you stopped isn't better, but
doesn't make it any better. Yes. You know what I'm talking about, though.
Yeah, did the hand motion and everything.
Yeah, the clanging balls.
Yeah, I think everyone knows what you're actually.
Yes, because it has that same sort of. There's like this sort of. There's a soothing, peaceful thing to that, which is why they exist.
Yeah.
And that this kind of had that. You're right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's interesting that it gets down to the final two, including Elizabeth, just because we knew Elizabeth was in such danger. So there was a lot of suspense there, just in the sense of like, might she win and just upset all those plans? And I was especially conflicted because, well, I don't know, just like on the one hand, I really like the idea of this Strike Force alliance, and I kind of feel like I want to see that succeed. But I like Elizabeth. I don't really want her to go either. So anyway, but Elizabeth does go out, and so Allison wins the first individual immunity. Good for her. She's very proud of herself, and that's nice.
Yep.
So at this point, I actually have in my notes, editing would have us believe that Elizabeth is doomed, not sure what could change that now. And then sure enough, the answer is nothing. They can do lots of Sturm und Drang to to try to make it seem like it's possible that it could be something else. And some of it was real and some of it was, you know, just playing up.
Yeah, I mean, I think they were all, but again, just like we're looking back now against 2 episodes and seeing some of the payoff, I think some of these conversations are going to have some payoff. I think the fact that, you know, Angelina, for all the faults that we've discussed, she's smart. Like,
she's a proactive player, and I definitely like that.
She's proactive and she's smart, and she's realized that Christian is an incredible threat, because what's happening, I guarantee, like, well, obviously we see with John and all of them, like, just like we are becoming endeared to him, I guarantee his tribe mates are too, and he is incredibly smart and very likable, and, you know, I mean, he's playing a really good game, and Angelina saw right through that. You know, the other obvious, and then the flip side of that is Angelina, you know, the sort of, you know, the falseness that she puts forward, like, that's discussed a lot. And so, yeah, there's no payoff on this one, but I think even more than just the putting out the red herrings of making this seem like it wasn't going to happen, like it might not just be Elizabeth, I think it's laying some groundwork for the conversations that are going to happen episodes from now.
And the thing is, it might have gone another way. Like, there was discussion, and there was at least a group meeting where they seemed to come to a group discussion and consensus of changing the vote to Christian, right? Like, that happened, and that could have played out. But we know that Alec didn't want that to happen because it disrupts his alliance plan. We have John and Dan both bummed to lose Christian, and Dan is especially would rather have Elizabeth go because she's after him. So, like, that's what ultimately manages to shift it back.
Right.
And I was a little bit surprised, like, Angelina leaned into, like, the military jargon in her pitch to switch it to Christian, and so she seemed pretty pleased with herself about it. But then Dan, like, your husband's in the military, not you. And I'm like, that seems like a pretty, I'm not sure why that's a thing to object to.
I kind of see, like, I think they both sort of took it to extremes. Like, I think it's part of, like, the falseness that she, like, leaves them with, that it wasn't the fact that she was talking in military terms. It's that, like, it felt like she played it up, you know, and you know, take her husband out of it. It's like she thought this was, like, this super clever thing that she was doing. And, like, I'm going to really, like, emphasize that I'm talking like the military, and that rang untrue with them. And that was Dana's reaction to it, as opposed to, like, him, like, legitimately saying, like, thinking that you shouldn't use military terms just because your husband's in there. What he's really thinking is, and he's not able to express, is you overplayed this in a way that just felt uncomfortable, and I don't really know any other way to attribute it.
Well, I think there's also an element of he does not want to explain why he doesn't want to change the vote to Christian.
Also very also true. Yeah. So
he has to come up with some other reason. And I think that there could be some of that happening subconsciously, even beyond whatever he's actively thinking about. But in any event, I think that to some extent there's, like, I don't want to claim that this is the primary issue, but I think that there is at least a little bit of a gender thing where Angelina, by being a proactive player who pushes for things that she thinks are good moves, even if they go against what the rest of the group had been agreed on, she is seen as pushy and or phony for that reason, in a way that a man wouldn't for doing the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's probably something to pay attention to. You know.
Yeah. Now, I mean, I'm not absolving her of you know, any any flaws, but I think there was maybe a little bit of an element of that.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah. In the meantime, I liked Gabby being kind of frustrated with the idea of just sacrificing Elizabeth. And so it's like, as much as she doesn't want to give up on this other plan, she's going to try to say, like, well, do we think that there's maybe a way to, if nothing else, try to exacerbate some of the other flaws in the splintering in the Goliath tribe?
Yeah.
And so Alec and Allison talk about Angelina being the master manipulator. And so to some extent, it's also not just an expression of her being phony so much as she is a power player who is maybe a little too obvious about it.
Yeah.
And so she's a threat for that reason. But at the same time, they know that their sort of strike force plan relies on not giving away the game too soon, which means that even if they do think that Angelina is a real threat, they don't want to take her out yet. But in any event, that's where we get the conflict of, it's interesting that they managed to very cleverly make Dan and John the bad guys in forcing the vote change back and telling Angelina that's what's happening. So yeah. Alec and Allison are like, we're going to take these two other guys that aren't in on our plan and make them do the dirty work for saving our guy, which I thought was pretty clever on their part. So now it's Angelina Angelina's mad at them. They're the face of the changing it back, which disguises the real underlying motivation, which I thought was great.
Yeah, I get, now that you bring that up, I hadn't really thought about that. That you're right. That is actually really genius. So
yeah. So I think that there was an element of Dan and John being a little condescending to Angelina, in the sense that I think that she was completely justified in her feeling that I made a pitch to the whole group and it seemed like we came to a consensus about something. And now I hear that you guys had a separate conversation without me, and now you're just showing up to tell me that we've changed it back. That's kind of unfair. And again, it's like, it's not productive to whine about things being fair in this game. Sometimes that stuff happens. But I think she's right to feel the way she did. It's like, it's one thing to say, let's discuss as a group. And if you guys are actually not on board, then let's talk about it. But for you guys to agree with me to my face and then discuss it behind my back and change your minds and then just tell me that it's not going to happen without letting me be part of that conversation. But see, what's the interesting other layer about that is we know that that's kind of actually not what's really happening anyway. Because Dan and John are kind of being manipulated by Alec and Allison.
Yeah.
Which I all of that's really interesting. There's so many moving pieces in this setup right now, which I love.
Yeah, I'm really thrilled with a lot of what's going on. So
yeah. So let's see. Dan's perspective that, like, we want to get rid of the chaos, meaning we had a plan and then you wanted to change it up, and that's the chaos. So we want to just go back to the original plan. But again, it's funny because, like, that's not even his real reason.
Right.
And so in any event, Angelina now goes to Allison and John away from Dan and complains about how that all went down. The fact that Dan really came across as the bad guy in that whole situation, I think is a flaw in his own play, his own handling of that whole situation. Because it's interesting that, Dan and John approached her together, and yet John was included when she's complaining about Dan.
Right. And that goes back to what I was talking about, like in the onset of this conversation about my concerns with Dan and having two idols, is just the way that the overconfidence with which he's going to he just talks in a different way because he feels so secure in his position. And that's what makes it easier to target him. And just in all of our talking about all this, like, I think what we're identifying is there's sort of this, whether or not it's overall genuine, like the genuineness with which the one-to-one communications are happening is making a huge difference in like people's perceptions on stuff. And so when Angelina doesn't feel as real one-to-one, she's getting cast aside. When Dan doesn't feel, he's getting the beat, he's blamed for it because he doesn't feel as genuine, because he's coming with a little bit more arrogance than maybe John is, who's a little dialed down. So
so here's the point where Angelina makes what I think is a very human mistake, but a mistake nonetheless, which is recognizing that she can't change everybody's mind. And so even though she wanted to try to save Elizabeth, she could not. And so let's take for a moment the fact that its jury management was probably not totally away from her mind. But I also suspect it was not necessarily the primary reason. It might have been part of it. It's hard to know, but we can imagine that there was some real sincere emotion of being bummed that she wanted to save Elizabeth and couldn't.
Right.
But it's obviously a huge strategic mistake for reasons that we saw play out immediately. It is giving the person who's going home definitive proof that they have to do something desperate in order to scramble to save themselves.
Right.
And so there's that. And it also managed to change the conversation in the tribal council to Elizabeth targeting her instead of Elizabeth, say, targeting Dan. Right? So, right. Which is how it might have gone down otherwise. So we could see that there's obviously a mistake from a strategic point of view, but I think it's also not real. Like, on the one hand, she probably did actually feel bad for Elizabeth. But on the other hand, if you think about it from the perspective of real empathy, instead of just, this situation makes me feel sad, what does it help Elizabeth to be told in advance? Does it really? Or does it make Angelina feel better?
It doesn't help Elizabeth, except that she can maybe make the attempt to blow things up, and in a different situation, maybe there's a crack. It didn't work in this one, but.
Well, but also she didn't frame it that way. She didn't tell you, look, I did all I could, but this looks like it's going to happen, so you better do something. It was more like, you're doomed. I'm sorry.
I'm your friend. Yeah.
Yeah. And whether that's jury management or whether it's coming from a real place of not wanting people to dislike you or be mad at you, which is fair, it's nonetheless not something like her intention was not to let Elizabeth know that she had to do something.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, you're right.
It was to say, look, I tried to help you, so don't be mad at me that you're about to be voted out.
Right.
And that could be sincere and not just cynical jury manipulation. It kind of works for both if it comes across as genuine. And I think that even, to Elizabeth's credit, I don't think she really even necessarily saw it as insincere, but recognized, I'm trying to play survivor here, and you have just told me, A, that I need to do something desperate, and B, have given me something that I could use against you. And so the idea of, was there anything wrong? with Elizabeth exploiting that and turning it against Angelina. And we could certainly imagine Angelina feeling that way. Like, I was trying to be nice to you and you've betrayed me, betrayed my trust with it. You've used it against me. I should have just lied and not been nice to you. Except that, as we kind of just discussed, was it really being nice to her, or was it just trying to make herself feel better?
And it probably borders, honestly, the reality is it's probably somewhere in between.
Yeah.
She's probably not a bad person and did feel bad for her.
Yeah.
And it's like when we talk about when, you know, people are excited when the strategy aligns with what they want to do, or take what they want to do and assign a strategy to it. Like, it's sort of that whole cloud there.
Yeah.
Like, it's the same thing. Like, I feel bad that she's getting targeted. And I also would like to have her on my side on the jury.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll go say something to her. Like, you know, and it was a miscalculation and honestly may have larger repercussions than the stuff that happened in the episode prior. Yeah.
I think it does. I mean, I have a hard time seeing how she could possibly win at this point because of this. Not necessarily just this individual decision, but the fact that she has now been tarred with that label of wanting to manipulate the jury. Like,
in front of everyone who's going to be on the jury.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's so the jury tribal council discussion ends up being all about that, even though Elizabeth is ultimately voted out. And it, unanimously, which again makes it pretty transparent that it was a done deal. Like, so all of the getting up and whispering in the middle was kind of, who knows what that was about, but doesn't seem likely that it was ever really going to be anyone else.
No, it just seemed confirmation that, hey, even in light of all of these things,
we're sticking with the plan.
Sticking with the plan.
She's making a scene.
Right. And we'll deal with this information later.
Yeah.
Which is where the Angelina part, like, you know.
Mm-hmm. Which again is great news for the Strike Force Alliance. And, and like Mike's plan that we talked about earlier, of the idea of, if anyone is going to be blamed for a splintering Goliath tribe, we want it to be someone else and not us.
Right.
Even though they're the ones with the real plan to splinter the alliance. And it's actually Angelina of these various people who is the one that's not talking about splitting the Goliath tribe.
Right.
So in any event,
ultimately very satisfying for those of us who are rooting for the people that we are rooting for.
Yes. Yes. So sad to see Elizabeth go, but I think at the same time that I liked her as a person. I don't think she was a great player that was destined to win. So it's, I liked that as she had her torch snuffed, she goes up there with a chin up to Probst and says, my goal was to have fun and be myself, and I did. And I liked that.
Yes.
And then this was also let's see, any other big moments? I guess I was thinking to myself, even during the tribal council, that I suspected Elizabeth was still going to go, just because no matter how much they distrust Angelina, they shouldn't give up the numbers to take her out when they are so close to being able to solidify having the majority again.
Exactly.
Because if you get rid of her, now the Davids have the majority.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, there was no way it would have been a smart move to do that. But in any event, I think that kind of does it for these two episodes.
Yep.
All right. So, I think as far as next week, do you want to try to do another session like this? Or alternately, if you are available to do something Thanksgiving weekend, I will be back in the States as of the 21st.
I mean, we can look at this time next. I'm not sure what my schedule is going to look like for next weekend yet. So
that's all right. So we'll play that by ear. So
yeah.
Thank you everyone for watching and or listening. We're glad we could get caught up. And as for next week, we'll either have an episode or not, depending on if we can make it happen. But in the meantime, I'm having a good time in Korea. So that's going well. All right. So we'll leave it there. And thanks everybody. And watch Good Survivor. I feel like we had like, I don't know. Goodbye. Good night, everybody.
That's a different one. Yeah.
Yeah.